colleagues talk about my book and tell me it's 6 pounds. They don't tell me how many pages there are. They probably didn't read it, but they tell me it's very heavy. And I'm very fortunate because it's also been translated into Japanese and Chinese. Again, of course I can't read it, but I'm very pleased that it has that recognition. Talking about modern architecture, and I think Richard reminded me what he did with the students, is looking at it in a very general, universal sense. Richard referred back to the World Heritage Convention as an example. And the reason we did that is because it doesn't put a timeline on it. Because if you look at the classical preservation in America, we're really talking about either 30 or 50 years. So we really wanted to look at the value of the heritage as a major example. But before that, I'd like to explain to you what Docomomo is. It's a very funky name. Nobody really remembers, but kind of, sort of, maybe always knows what it's about. It means documentation and conservation of the monuments and sites of the modern movement. It started in the Netherlands in the early 90s, trying to preserve particular buildings that were actually from the interwar period, so not between World War I and World War II, and I'll show you one of the examples. Right now, we have about 60 countries and in all 5 continents. And I'm the president of Docomomo-US, which is a 501c3, and it's one of those chapters. And what you can see on the map is, this is just looking at the Americas. The dots are places where there are Docomomo chapters. And I think it's interesting to look at it because it shows you the interest there is in taking care, dealing with the heritage that is really very modern. So it's not just a localized interest, it really is part of what's happening in most of the sections of the world where architects and designers and people interested in design and architecture begin to look at what to do with these buildings that really are very significant in time in terms of where they come from. So Docomomo-US is a 501c3. We have 17 chapters, and we have 5 what we call friends organizations, which are groups of people interested in a particular community where we really feel there's no use for us to have a chapter, but still we would like the affiliation, and they would like the affiliation, looking at a broader scale, looking at the other things that other people are doing. And the map is actually out of date. As you can see, Indiana is listed as information. And of course, in the last couple of weeks, Indiana Land is one of our friends groups, again, as a part of the expansion of the network of people and organizations working together for modern architecture. What I do is I talk a lot. And not only do I teach, I also preach a lot. And I'm very glad that it's connected to sound installation here, so I can really make my voice much more heard. And I come into churches, and this is I'm lecturing here and talking is the first science, Christian Science in Houston, where we had our national conference a couple of months ago. Where we again bring people together to talk about how we deal with a very significant modern heritage that we all know about, but really have not had a good direction as to what to deal with it. One of the other things we do is we have an awards program, because part of what bringing the education and the appreciation back is also highlighting those things that we think are good. And so this year we did, for the first time, we did an awards program looking at American projects. And of course, there were some obvious ones in there, but there are also ones in there that because of their, let's say, modesty, lack of a better word, they're really intervening into an existing building in a way that was supportive of the existing building and really brought out a very good character. And we do tours. But tours to us is, and I guess I talk from personal experience, I go on tours to places I can get into, because that's the only way I can see all the things that otherwise are not accessible. And here you'll see a group of people on top of Alvar Aalto's Baker House in MIT in Boston, where they get a tour from the architect who did restoration and look and talk about what is happening behind the scenes. So it's not just a superficial tour, it's really a very specific program as to what this is all about. So the question is, what's heritage? What does it really mean? What does this word mean? And I like to begin at the beginning. I'm Dutch. And the one on the right side is the canal I grew up in. And as you can see, that's one of the foundation problems even in the 13th century. And it's the old church. The one on the left side is the new church. So here we have old versus new, except one is 13, the other one is 14th century. So really, old and new is it's a very fungible concept. It depends on which side of the fence you're in. The interesting part is, now you imagine me, I graduated from architectural school and I went to America. So what did they do on my first field trip? They took me to look at a church in Newburgh, New York, and said to me, this is a very old church. It's 1830. And they said, it looks Dutch. I looked at it, classical revival to me, there's nothing Dutch about it. So here, there was my perception of what was old, and what was their perception of what was old. It really matters as to where you are in how you think about this. And I think that's really part of the lesson that comes back when you look at modern architecture is it's not about age, it's about value, it's about significance. And so clearly the church on the left had a great deal of significance within the community or in the architectural history or whatever significance you want to attach to it. It wasn't just about age. But it gets better. When you look at on the slide, you see what really, let's say, 70, 60% of Netherlands is below the sea table. And so the interesting part is here, there's this management model called the polder model. And polder, of course, is the Dutch word for reclaimed land. But it means you have to agree to something collectively in order to do something. Because you can imagine, if your neighbor doesn't maintain its dike, it doesn't really matter that you maintain the dike, you're still going to get flooded. So very early on in the 13th century, they decided we're going to work together. And so it's the same process, by the way, that you find in the Mississippi Valley in the early part of the 19th century, where the Creole sugar plants got together and did an annual inspection of the dike, because obviously their sugar would grow if the guy got third in the job. So clearly there is a way of community planning and involvement that has a degree of self-interest. But I want to bring back to this perception of heritage. This is the image I got from a friend of mine in Atlanta. And he thought it was totally appropriate because, one, it had a windmill, and two, it was thrifty. So again, the perceptions of what cultures are all about is really very much bound as to where you are and where you're coming from. I think that there's a lesson here when we make judgments and make values and significance. It's very important to begin to look at where it's coming from and how. I think that, and I really am not talking about architectural history, but I want to sort of put out sort of thoughts here in terms of how this all fits together. And the question then becomes, what are those influences that we all talk about, and that I'm sure it also came up in the WEAS symposium that happened a couple of weeks ago. And I think there are very obvious sources. There are very obvious sources that anybody talks about. It's the Bauhaus in Dessau, Walter Gropius in the mid-1920s. But again, you look at the curtain wall. That curtain wall is an East German aluminum construction of the mid-1970s. So again, we're looking at something to give value to and to make it significant, but it actually is a reconstruction, actually a pretty decent reconstruction of something that disappeared. So again, in how we make our judgments, we have to be very careful as to what we're looking at. But if the Bauhaus is that one part, then I would think in talking about, particularly in Columbus or in the Midwest, about significance of modern architecture, there's sort of two influences in a very general sense that you can talk about. You talk about the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA in New York, and we're looking here on the sculpture garden out from the new Taniguchi building. It's sort of one strain of modernism. But I think that for what we are talking about here, the other one, and much of discussion about that, of course, is Cranbrook. Really what happens in Cranbrook, and obviously a lot of the architects and designers working in Columbus have very clear affiliations with Cranbrook, either through the family or study or whatever reasons they are, so they're very much into part of that development. But if we are talking about it today, we also need to talk about popular culture. And if you look at what's happened, well, again, when I started talking about this 20 years ago, I did not get 50 people in the room. And so you can see that the popular perception of this has really changed. By the way, I've never watched this show, so I have no opinion on this, but clearly from the visual point of view, there was a great deal of interest that helps to foster interest in many different ways. But I think that preservation or conservation of modern heritage is becoming very much a worldwide exercise. And I'm only going to show you two examples that I think in their own way are exemplary for two different reasons. And what I'm showing you here is an aerial photograph of a TB sanitarium, about 1930. And to me, it was a good reminder because TB, of course, major causal deaths up until the 1950s in both America and elsewhere in Europe. So it really was very much part of it. And so they designed, this is the Diamond Workers Union in Amsterdam, designed this building for their workers. So there's this other part of what I would say modernism is a social, collective, public health issue to it, which part of it has to do with the transparency, part of it with glass, whatever else it has to do with. So it's more than just aesthetics. I think that's part of what I try to convey to my students, is that it's not just aesthetics, it's also about the value of architecture to us as a community, and it's the kind of reason why ultimately actually Docomomo got started. The people that started were 2 years ahead in architectural school and felt there was a need to come back to some core values in terms of architecture. The building is very simple. You can see it's utterly transparent. This has been restored. It took about 10 years to come to this point. It was built as a sanatorium. For a while it was a hospital, and now it's a medical facility, an ambulatory facility that the building can accommodate without major changes. And again, that's something I want to come back to because it's one of the other arguments we very often see. And it's quite beautiful, it's very simple. And in many ways, that of course also presents different problems because you can hide anything. So below very clear, both in the design and the restoration. The other one I would show you is the Alto Library in Viborg, or Victory, whichever way you want to talk about. It's mid-1930s. It was built originally in Finland. Of course, now it's Russia as a result of the changes of World War II. And it's a collective project between the Finns and the Russians. And what's interesting about it is the impeccable research that was being done. In terms of the Finns driving it, because Alto is a Finnish hero like Sibelius and others, but also in terms of how they managed to work with the Russians. What's interesting about it also shows you how the limitations are, because Alto did this when he was just out of school. I mean, he wanted as a competition. He didn't have much other work. He went to the site in the summer, and of course, he changed things. Like any good architect, you look at it, you don't like it, you change it. And of course, there's no documentation, because he was there. So you see that from a restoration point of view, it would present a different kind of issues because of him being present. This is the new the main library hall restored. It's probably the railing of that you see on the staircase is probably one of the most comfortable railings I've ever seen. You put your hand on it, it's really beautiful. It goes with you. The books aren't back yet, but I'm sure that will be coming shortly. So let's talk a couple of issues. I talk a little bit about misperceptions, perceptions we have about heritage, perceptions we have about buildings. But I think that you can also do this talking about it in terms of modern architecture. For a very long time, there was this perception that it was bad. And I'm here using the quote of Charles Jenks, talking about that modern architecture died in 1972. The reason, of course, he's writing about it because it's the time that Prudon, the project designed by Yamasaki in St. Louis in the early 1950s, was blown up. And again, to shows that part of the dilemma that we've seen in the last 2 decades is that the quality of the architecture is basically covered over by social policy. That's part of it. Wasn't maybe not just Yamazaki building, but he's not to blame for everything. So part of that stigma has taken a long time to deal with because so much of that reference has been there. Even Craig Ferguson, he's Scottish, and he's talking here about Cumbernauld. Cumbernauld was one of the English new towns which were built as part of the reconstruction after World War II. And it is similar stigma as you'll see in, as we saw in Prudon. And a couple of years ago, I was in Scotland and I said, oh, I don't see it. I looked at him and said, why? It's bad. And so it was actually not as bad as I expected. It was very much of a period piece in terms of its architecture, in terms of its shopping. But again, there was this the immediate reaction that it wasn't very good. And I think that's part of the dilemma that we still have to some extent to overcome. The other discussion is what I would call craft versus machine. And it is going back to looking at a project like this. This is something I did some years ago, the Tesla Terrace in Central Park, about mid-1850s, early 1860s. There's no question that anybody around here, you and anyone else, will say, this is important. And part of that comes back to what I would call the craft of making. You look at a sculpture like this, I don't remember the sculptor, the quality of the work, the carving, both in its expression and in its detail, is to the extent that we can look at this carving, I can tell you, as a botanist, I can tell you what plants they were. And so there is a level of appreciation that is very different of how we approach architecture, modern architecture. So I think keep that in the back of your head that to me, modern architecture is about the craft of design. It's not not as much about the craft of making as it is about the craft of design. Because at the end of the day, it is really that machine phenomenon. And we've been doing this, we've been tinkering with this for a very long time. And again, I just pick an example here of the Notre Dame in Paris. Villain was putting cast iron heads on these statues in the mid-19th century. So he was already beginning to come to a mechanical way of dealing with a significant object. And so the transition we're in is a very long transition. But I think that part of dealing with modern architecture, so I'm taking it back to Columbus, there's nobody here would ever not argue that this is not a historic building. And there's an appreciation for the fact that it's old and has been built and has qualitative value in terms of its surface texture, whatever else it is, that you wouldn't necessarily find with a modern building. Which is why it's not entirely true. One of the most fascinating pieces I've worked on is Watts Hall. Here is a man probably in the 50s or so, begins to make, in his spare time, towers using bed springs and broken crockery. Why it's interesting is also that from a preservation point of view, ultimately, in my theory, this gets rebuilt. Because the qualitative work of what was being done is such that there is no other way of keeping it by rebuilding it. So I think there's another part that you'll see in the discussion is that part of the preservation of modern architecture is about scale, it's about time. At the end of the day, a cathedral will get rebuilt in 500 years or 1,000 years, whatever the time frame is. We do it in 6 months. And so basically, the time frame makes this valuable difference, but at the end of the day, the process and the outcome is similar in the sense of not being entirely original or authentic. I think that this discussion has come out, particularly in the last 10 years, apropos an example as Legal House. Building designed by Gordon Gunshaft of SLM in the early 1950s, and a curtain wall that failed from the very beginning. There's articles in the paper about the thing leaks. At the end of the day, the whole curtain wall gets replaced. And here, the decision was made, partially because of pressure in the community, to duplicate visually exactly what was there. Not physically, not in terms of its makeup, but in terms of how it looks. And so here you can see there's a very clear distinction in what we have done before, is that we really go back to what was there. I want you to look at the picture on the right. And the picture on the right, because that is a photograph of Warwick Park Avenue in the early 1950s. For us, it's very hard to realize what an incredibly stunning, incredibly challenging building it was when it was built, because everything around it was neoclassical or Italian Renaissance masonry apartment buildings. Today, there are so many other buildings next to it that have similar kind of curtain walls that we sometimes lose the fact that these were very important buildings at the time. So that the significance is not only present, it's only there because of the earlier impact. Part of this is in the discussion that we need to think about is interior design. We're not there yet, but the profession of interior design as we know it today is essentially in post-war development. What we're looking at is the original Lever headquarters. It's not there anymore. I took these pictures in the early 90s. Designed by Raymond Loewy. Raymond Loewy was an industrial designer. He made packages for Lever. He didn't know any interiors. So it's the transition of a new discipline and a new qualitative part of the interior, which is actually still quite rich. And I really like that ceiling with these very, very free-form lids. But as I said, no, this is just the curtain wall failed in the beginning. You see on the left side what I used to see out of my office in terms of what that curtain wall looks like, because they replaced glass, it broke, and they kept going. And of course, it's like repainting a space, you match it to what you had last, and of course, by the end, by the 10 times, you are totally off in color. And ultimately, what they did is they basically replaced the entire wall and redesigned it. And what you see in the slide is on the left side is existing, on the right side is the new one. If you look very closely at the detail, you will see that the depth of things have changed. But visually seen from the outside, it is similar, but it actually isn't. Because this comes back to the discussion Louis and I had just a few minutes ago, is that materialities change. The building was built on drawn sheet glass was the normal product, which is slightly weighted. In the late 1950s, they came out with float glass, which is what you see here, which is absolutely perfect. So that the building is actually more perfect than it ever was before. So again, how close are we to the original is, you can argue about it, because clearly if we were able to compare it, we would see a great deal of difference. So again, you see how the criteria begin to change and appreciation change. If you look at it today, if you think back a few minutes ago about the other image, it looks very perfect. And it is very, very beautiful. The other part, like words obsolescence. What makes modern buildings so different from before is that the typological precision by which they were designed is far more specific. In the Middle Ages, you had 4 building types. You had a church, you had a town hall, you had a house, and you had some sort of factory place or a storage place. So you really structurally, physically, technology-wise, very much within a very strict tradition. If you look at, let's say, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where we begin to design buildings for a specific purpose, with that becomes, of course, the problem that if that purpose changed, that building needs to be adapted. And so part of what the discussion these days about modern buildings is about the fact they don't fit what it is there. And we have new plans, or we have a new production process, or we have a new philosophy about what the workplace looks like. And to some extent that's true. And I don't necessarily want to challenge it completely, but I want to challenge it on the basis of modesty. We think we know what's going to happen tomorrow, and we actually don't. And the classic example to me is either airports. What we thought 20 years ago airports were all about has completely changed. And or banks. Banks, Very branch banks have changed in the last 10 years, and customer service is slowly coming back into the branch. So you can see that we have all these predictions, so that we have to be very careful when we do that. I've taken TWA as an example, and I won't go because, again, the CERN connection back to Columbus, how interesting it is to see what he was doing. He designed it for TWA, but the building was obsolete by the time it was finished, because the introduction of jumbo jets made the capacity, both the height of the gates and the sizes of the gates, as well as the number of seats in the gates. And then, of course, the luggage, because it makes a very big difference if you have 100 people or 300 people in the planes, and you've got to accommodate them. So then the building was, from the very beginning, obsolete, and the struggle ever since. The other interesting part is that the reviews originally were not very good. So that the consensus that if we would probably also look into when we do preservation again, is that we look at reviews from the 1950s and the 1960s as criteria for acceptance. And we've got to be very careful with that, because they were also written within their own context. And here's an example where the review was mixed. And for us, there would be no question that this building was a very important building. This is on construction. You see the thin kind of shell concrete roof that Eminent Whitney and Efroymson designed for the building. I've always wondered whether you looked at this. I mean, I'm walking around in Palm Springs a year ago, and I looked at the back of the car. Sort of the same design aesthetic, right? Again, it maybe is a visual anomaly, but it's kind of interesting how you see the homogeneity of design at the period, which of course translates itself back into the building. This is the building the way it looked in the early 1970s, when you could still take photographs of airports without being arrested. And you see the original signage, which again is very low for TWA. So it very clearly is an iconic building, and therefore the preservation was possible. Because even then, when American Airlines took over at TWA, they closed the terminal a year earlier than they said they were going to do it. It's been empty ever since. It's been restored on the outside. But finding a purpose for it has been very difficult. And part of it is the issues of accessibility, of size, et cetera, et cetera. So the building is still there, but pretty obsolete. But you got to admit, it's pretty stunning. There's again a photograph of the early 1970s. All of that is still there. The fortunate part of our preservation always is that TWA never had any money to change it. Otherwise they would have. And so part of the economic problems of TWA are a blessing to us today. And of course, the relationship, again, talking about perceptions, the relationship between the airside and the terminal. And you could look outside, you could see planes coming and going, which is part of the experience of an airport. And certainly, what happens now is that you'll see in the back is the new terminal designed by Gensler, accommodating JetBlue mostly, and of course that relationship between the air side and the terminal has changed. This has been a 10-year battle. I got involved in this in the advocacy end probably 10 years ago. And we have made incremental changes to keeping things. The piers that were coming out where the gates were, we couldn't say, but we have the bridges to the connecting pieces that were connecting you back to the terminal. So again, parts of it salvaged. And so in many ways, the National Trust or others see it as a success story. I'm not entirely positive about that. Some you lose. And I think this is one of the most recent battles, of course, is the Penn Women's Hospital. And Bernard Goldberg was a very iconic architect. I mean, his corncob buildings in Chicago clearly are very well accepted as apartment and residentials. When the building was built, it was actually on the forefront of maternity treatment or processes. So in many ways, the building was very well designed and programmed from the very beginning. But obviously, here's back to the obsolescence part, things change, and so that the adaptability, this is all poured in place concrete, and there's serious stuff here. So you couldn't really do much with it. The inflexibility of the building also made it very difficult to adapt. I'm not sure, this is one of those images that appeared in the New York Times, and Theodore came up with it. When you come to this point, I would agree, just put it all with this. You're so far away from what the original intent was that making recorded, documented, but this is not the solution. So again, in that sense, I'm not advocating that, advocating demolition, but this is worth its taking place now. It's being taken down, and it's one of the things that we can say. One of the interesting things is, I call transparency, the role of glass in modern architecture. A little bit of reference to it earlier, when we were talking about the TV set and the role of light in therapy in medical treatment, but also the role of glass in terms of inside versus outside. And it's one of the reasons why it makes heritage so different, because you cannot ignore the inside anymore. If you have a sloppy inside, it's part of your outside. You can close the curtains occasionally, but basically the interior architecture is very much part of the exterior architecture. And so therefore a lot of sort of district designations, or you can say, oh, as long as it's 18 inches away from the glass, it doesn't really matter because of the Victorian wall ratio between solid versus closed there. In modern architecture, you can. And I'm using the example of the bank on Washington Street. And I don't know the exact date, but I think it's about the same time as this one, which is Barshant's Manufacturers Hanover Trust of the early 1950s. What's interesting here, I want to take you through the sequence of what happened to it, because it begins to see and talk about the levels of intervention that we can do in architecture, or should explore in architecture in order to find uses for, ongoing uses for this building. Well, imagine, this is on Fifth Avenue. It's a major shopping district. So therefore, a location like this is extremely valuable. Initially, is that the bank had its side entrance at 43rd Street because they wanted to show off the bank. They wanted to show off the vault, that you could see where your money was. And again, it's sort of very totally different from a 19th century bank, where of course you would have bars and granite blocks and rustication to suggest that it was safe. Here it was about transparency, which is one of the reasons this bank and of course also the Saarinen Bank are so significant, because it's a totally different perception of what banking was all about. You can also see that on the top floor where the workstations are, that those workstations are part of the exterior architecture. So you have to be very careful how you fill this in, because you are affecting the overall perception of the building. This is what it looks like now, Joe Fresh. And two things are significantly different. One is that they wanted an entrance on Fifth Avenue. As a retailer, I want my entrance on the major street. And so there's this whole battle back and forth as to how far to go and how far the changes are. And ultimately, they got their entrance. The second part is light levels. And I think we don't talk yet enough about light levels. Our light levels are significantly higher than they've ever been before. And if you're a retailer and you need to see the merchandise, obviously you need even more light. So that really part of the visual perception of the building is also the change of the light. The light intensity is different. So you can see the entrance. And this is what it looks like on the inside. Another major change. When they moved the entrance to the avenue, you also need to change the escalator. And so the whole experience of the building is different. Again, we can argue about it different ways, and I've argued with my students about it in different ways. But they get a 90-degree change of the escalator. There was an escalator there. Is very different. And as a result of that, you can barely see in the back corner there, there's a mobile designed by Harry Bertoya that sort of hangs in the middle space. It was actually designed to be on the top of the stair. So you would come up to it and you'd see the filigree of the sculpture, and of course that's what covered the walls. Again, back to the interior. On the back, one of the big battles was the Victoria screen, because it was a very long, the screen designed by her in Victoria, that they actually took down. And part of the preservation battle was to get this thing back. Because this screen was also visible from the outside. So it was part of the visual architecture of the banquet hall. So it wasn't just a piece of sculpture. It was very much integrated into the architecture, because behind there are the elevators that go to the floors. So what my argument was coming back to is that design is a very critical part of the craft of architecture. And so therefore, part of our significance and how we look at it has to come back to the design, not just to the materiality or the romance of the makeup. And that doesn't mean there is no making involved. Of course, there is a great deal of making involved. And I'm showing you some of the prototypes of the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames. On the left side is the splint they did working for the Navy, and of course on the right side are the chairs. So it's not that it's totally devoid, but that the ultimate product is really the craft of design. And I want to bring it back to Columbus. I really like 301 Washington. And I like it because on the one hand, it's a period piece as a piece of architecture. It's also a period piece in terms of preservation, because the interventions being done here by Alexander Girard are what we did in the 70s. And so in one way, it's this intersection between modern architecture, modern design, and old architecture is interesting in its own right. And then, of course, on top of that is the intervention itself, the design, and of course the interior furniture. Again, very, very, very typical, very important as part of their period. Let me bring it back to Columbus. And I guess as an outsider, I cannot talk to any great detail about a lot of the specific history of buildings. But I think what's always struck me, and I'm sure that in the various nominations that comes forward, is the history of the program itself. The program of designing these significant buildings over a long period of time. And I know that Irwin Miller looked at the State Department as the starting point. Again, we come back to Sarin. Sarin was very much part of that. And it will be very interesting. Columbia has got a whole series of reading minutes of the Architectural Advisory Board meeting picking architects. And I'm looking forward to one day reading about how other architects pick architects. And I can imagine it's going to be interesting. But be that as it may, it is back to the fact that it was a program designed to showcase American design across the world. And it was a very careful selection process in order to make sure that was being done. And of course, Simon did the embassies in Oslo and did Stockholm, perhaps in Denmark, etc., etc. So they're really very carefully showcasing architecture. The second part is that, again, it's the Cranbrook connection. It's the Cranbrook connection between the selection. Because if you look at who did it, granted, Louis Kahn got some work, SLM got some, but really it was the group that was in Cranbrook in the late 1930s, early 1940s that was doing this work. Of course, Hiram Reese was part of that. And so it's really interesting to see how that vision of design, advocating for design on a global sense or in a community sense, was really what was struck and was the model. The second part is that I think as a result of that, the collection that you have, and I keep using this word, like New York has MoMA, you have a collection of architecture. So you have another way of looking at it that nowhere else in the world or even in America you can find. So in itself as a collection, taking away from the individual buildings for a minute, I think it's a very important consideration. And so I put a couple of images there. And in my mind, if you look at the qualitative where this is I think you look at what do we see as the monuments of architecture, and which, by the way, is probably every architectural student will visit. I mean, regardless of why I did that twice, I was there in the 1970s when it looked like hell because it was really falling apart, and this is the more recent photograph. For Philip Johnson's glass house, which is actually not a very good building. But again, iconic in its cultural significance. And that's the kind of collection that I think we're talking about. And I think the reverence or the appreciation or the care that we have for that is what I would advocate also for you. Farnsworth. This is a photograph I took last year when they were doing repair work. It was a very iconic building. Of course, it's been flooded probably 3, 4, 5 times in different degrees. It needs a lot of work. And then looking at, this is what they're talking about now. This is what the plan the National Trust has been out there. Basically, to move the house further up the hill, build a concrete foundation, hydraulic elevation, and so put the house back so you can lift it up in the flood. I'm believing in dikes, so I mean, to me, you put a dike on, but you put it higher on the ground, and that's it. Water's water. But whatever. So I think this is interesting how, but it's an example of how significant the building is being considered. I think that's sort of or the Eames house. Again, an example, Charles and the Eames designed their house. It's been carefully restored with guidance and Getty in terms of it. What I want to show you is this. There's a strain here that we haven't talked about, which is that hazardous materials that are very popular at one point. What you're looking at here is an asbestos cement panel. Asbestos was used for everything from the late 19th century onwards. It didn't disappear out of our vocabulary until the early 1970s. So there's a lot of it around. Most of it's encapsulated in concrete or whatever else it is. But it's a reminder to us that whatever we do now, we should be very conscious as to the long-term impact. Because I think part of modern architecture we will be replacing some of that stuff because we cannot oversee what all of the implications are. And so to close this off, I'm putting the Miller House, because I think that's the kind of level collection I'm talking about. And while it may be less so known, certainly for its care, both in landscape, in terms of its interior or its exterior architecture, I think it has that significance. So really, that is the kind of thing that I want you to think about when you are making your decisions or suggestions about architectural significance. And as I said, I don't want to talk about Columbus per se, but I want to sort of put it into context. I want to put it in the context of how significant an interior or an exterior or a church. And that is in comparison to, for example, looking at some church architecture in Germany in the late 1930s, which is similar to it. So really clearly they were part of a very larger group. It wasn't isolated. And certainly church architecture in America and the post-war period and the churches that you have here are very much part of the enormous openness in church design that we see across the country. And again, to which very little attention so far has been paid. So I would argue that, again, looking at these very carefully is very important because of their larger cultural context. So what are the opportunities? So how are people doing? What are the people doing reflecting this enormous significance of modern architecture? There's the Michigan Modern Fund. The state of Michigan put money aside probably 2 to 3 years ago as part of economic development because clearly manufacturing jobs weren't coming back. And they were looking at another part of the legacy to see which had a larger cultural impact. And so they're talking about both the automobile industry and the furniture industry as being the two major forces in Michigan. And in my conversation, I've always said to them, Americans have 3 major parts. It's their car, their house, and their furniture. 2 of those are made in Michigan. So you can see the importance in that decoded context. And so they're really working on that very hard. Or what Palm Springs Modern does. Palm Springs is a community close to Los Angeles, it's about 2 hours, and they started Modernism Week. This year is the 10th time it happened. And it's a major boost at celebrating both their modern heritage, but also as part of what made economic development sense in the context. And so again, the advantage of it's very close to Los Angeles, but so it's another form of taking the modern heritage further. And then Sarasota, we were there as Docomomo at a conference there last year. It was the beginning of Sarasota modernism. So again, they're beginning to pick up on that same theme within the Florida context because of their architectural heritage. LA, with help from Getty, does a very large cultural survey, which is really great. It's very comprehensive and very unique to us looking at those images. I've talked about the voice programs. The World Monuments Fund, together with Noel, we're doing this for the 4th year, looking at heritage abroad. And what you see here is the call for nominations for this year, showing a school in Japan. And when we looked at this, I'm on the jury, when we looked at this, one of the boutique schools. If you're on the jury, you're picking at buildings you've never seen. You're always very weary because you don't know what they're giving you. And so we actually asked someone to go there and look at it. It's a very beautiful, very simple, modern addition to a 1950s Japanese school. And so that was Theodore from last year. Modernism Heritage, which is what we do. We all have the series. And apropos that, we have a young professional group in Boston and in New York that call themselves the Modern League. And they go look at something and then they have a judgment. There's nothing wrong with them. They're part of combining the social part with the architectural part. Of course, the collection of photos and images on the left, of course, is Paul Rudolph, then the Eases, Phil Johnson, Roy Harrison, of course, Mies van der Rohe. So all of the stars of modern architecture. The other thing they do is a dress-up ball for Halloween. It's called the Carnival Ball. Of course, it's partially Halloween, partially takeoff on the crochet. And dress-up is a very good old Beaux-Arts tradition to dress up as you're building. So on the left side, you see Frank Gehry's Fish House, and on the right side, of course, is the AT&T building by Phil Johnson. And so again, it is celebrating modern architecture, but also taking, looking at some pressure. Or, as I saw in Finland last year, you teach kids to the rules of the road in a little playground without modern architecture around it. Of course, these are buildings that are unable to scale down, but again, they will go. So again, it's part of education, it's part of appreciation, and part of it having fun with it. So what I come back to is then perceptions of the future. What do we do? And as I said, I don't know. The World's Fair was easy. You go in the circle, you look down, and it's all finished. And I don't know what it's going to be. But I would argue that even like look at Disneyland in the early 1970s, the world wasn't going to look like that. But I think whatever it is, I would like to end with the motto that's at the Library of Congress. And part of what we have in our heritage past is really to see what